I think we'll get going. Um, Welcome back to our One Museum, One Book club. We did take a few months off as the weather was warm and are excited to get going once again. Tonight we're discussing Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, which was picked to coincide with the opening of our newest exhibition, Rise Up. It opened on Sunday. It is fabulous. If you want to know a little bit more about it, do a quick Google search on Chicago Tribune. There was an article that hit today that was gives a nice review and a nice description of the exhibition. And it's also a book that's personally meaningful to our moderator, Matthew Sackel. Matthew is a longtime employee of the museum. How many years, Matthew?
14.
14 years in our education team, but he actually came in as the museum librarian. He received his master's degree in library and information science from Kent State University and created, as I said, the museum's library. So he was the brainchild behind that lovely collection that we have on the first floor off of our light side lobby. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew to get us going. Oh, a couple of like logistical things. I always forget this because I'm so ready to just start talking. Michelle Gatesy, who is the marketing coordinator on our team, is also on this Zoom with us. She and I will be helping Matthew get your conversations and questions into the discussion. So please, if you have something to say, raise your hand physically on the screen, raise your hand using the Zoom tool, and or put something in the chat, and we'll notice that, and then we'll say, hey Matthew, Adam Schwartz has a question, or oh Matthew, this question was just in the chat, and we'll allow Matthew to really think about the conversation and let Michelle and I keep the conversation going. So that's the way it works. If you have a question or comment, please free to add that in the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matthew. It's all yours.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew, Associate Manager in the Education Department. And as Marcy said, I've been with the museum for a very, very long time, longer than I was in high school, which is kind of hard for me to fathom right now. So tonight we are going to be talking about Giovanni's Room. And I'm hoping that all of you have read this. I'm assuming there are also some of you in the room who are like, maybe if this is awesome, I'm going to read it. So I'm going to make you think it's awesome. And number two, read it even if you don't think it's awesome. So let's give you a little bit of historical context. And before I do all of that, I want you to know that you can raise your hand at any time. Like I would love those. I don't even think of them as interruptions. I'm thinking of this as a conversation that we're having over Zoom, which is as good as we're going to get right now during these pandemic times. So some historical context. I will tell you, as Marcy mentioned, I am a librarian, and I'm going to confess something to all of you right now. I stole this copy. It's a first edition copy of Giovanni's Room from my college library. I worked at that library. I was too embarrassed to check it out in 1994. I was worried what people would think of me if they knew I was reading Giovanni's Room. This is 1994. It's 2021 now. And yes, I've had plenty of time to feel bad about it. And it's still at my house. So a little bit of context with this amazing tome. It was written in 1956 by James Baldwin, who we all hopefully know and love. He was a civil rights advocate and was hot on the heels of his latest novel called Native Son. Native Son was super popular. Everyone loved it. In New York Times, all of the publications ran reviews of it, giving him thumbs up, calling him the golden child of America. And then he wrote Giovanni's Room in 1956. James Baldwin is a Black American man. Giovanni's Room is about a white homosexual man. Mainstream press, and I'm talking 1956's New York Times, loved it. They were standing on the furniture jumping. They thought it was the greatest, like he had followed up Native Son, like he had done so well. The Black publications would not touch this with a barge pole. They would not review it. They would not talk about it in their media. And let's unpack that. So James Baldwin wrote this in 1956. Soon after a Dear Abby article was around the same time was written in, and Dear Abby by that time was syndicated. Abigail Van Buren, a nice Jewish lady from New York City. And some people wrote into the New York Times and said, Dear Abby, I need some advice. Gay people have moved into our condo complex. I don't know what to do. They're gonna ruin the place. They're gonna wreck the whole place. And Dear Abby's advice was, you should move. Immediately at that time, Dear Abby, Abigail Van Buren, became a movie star among the gay community, gay men especially. We love the fact, and yes, I identify, that she had said what most people were thinking, like, really? Like, this is a problem for you? James Baldwin's book was published right around the same time. So we know that this attitude was prevalent. If we want to rewind back a little bit, in Europe at the same time, because the war was just ending, there was paragraph 175. Paragraph 175 made it illegal to be a homosexual. And so being gay in Germany at this time, people were getting out of concentration camps and being like, hey, I got out of the concentration camp. And they were succinctly put into prison to serve out the rest of their sentences. Additionally, Giovanni's Room, which takes place, the author, David, the character that we find as the protagonist, is in France. And just as an FYI, homosexuality was illegal in France until 1984. So the fact that this book was written in 1956 was breaking all sorts of taboos. We don't blink an eye today. Today, people write all sorts of stuff, like stuff's in the newspaper, stuff is on the news. We don't really care. To give a little background on this, the Black publications largely ignored this because it was about white characters. The subject was about race, as in previous works. However, it wasn't about Black people. People were expecting, like, a Black author is supposed to be writing about Black things. What is this guy doing? And it was breaking taboos. He was already talking about homosexuality, which was also a taboo. It was illegal in most countries then. We're talking about in America, where he's writing this novel. We're talking something was going on called the Lavender Scare, where the US government was like, we know you're gay. Like, we're going to fire you if you work for the federal government. People didn't know what to think. This book comes out of nowhere and it's a firecracker. People are like loving the fact that James Baldwin had this voice. James Baldwin himself had a really rough upbringing. He's, and I'm proud to say, he found refuge in libraries. His father was Pentecostal and preached. And so Baldwin thought, you know what? I'm gonna make my dad love me. I'm gonna preach too. Well, Baldwin realized that this is not my cup of tea. I can't do this. But it did, from writing his sermons, make him realize, you know what, James, you're a really talented writer. Like, maybe you're onto something. So James Baldwin started writing. At the age of 17, which is the same year I started my freshman year of college, this guy moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, which was filled with the most diverse group of people this nice Pentecostal boy had ever seen in his whole life. And I'm sure it was eye-opening for him, but it also had a strong influence on him. He eventually moved to Paris. And when he moved to Paris, he had $40 in his pocket. And this is the James Baldwin that all of us know and love. So moving into the evolution of Giovanni's Room. First, I just, maybe a show of hands, have all of you read this book? Okay, I can see all the camera folks, the quiet people. If you could maybe click a hands up or let me know. Because just as a caution, there's some spoilers ahead. So we roll into Giovanni's room. Giovanni's room is set, the story itself is set in Paris, but the author is writing from the south of Paris. His life, by the time he's writing this, has completely fallen apart. And so I want to—
Matthew, I'm going to jump in. Can we get, some general reactions from our audience to the book? And
that's amazing.
Comment on the context, the historical context that Matthew has provided. Has that changed your point of view? I'd love to get some participation based on what Matthew's laid out so far.
Yeah, everyone chat. Don't be quiet.
I had two Rise Up tours today, group tours, virtual, from Atlanta, Australia, London. I mean, it was a global kind of business. At any rate, I was glad I read it. It gave me some, made me, is the word sympathetic or apathetic or more, just help me. I haven't seen the exhibit yet, and it's not something I've personally experienced. So reading the book, I think, was helpful for me to be able to relate to what I was sharing. And then I did look up some Nazi policy and was asked that, and the code 175. But someone in the chat put they were 30 and they had no idea about the discrimination and what was going on for gay people. So yeah, I just was glad I read it. But the one thing I kept thinking about was tortured soul. That just kept coming to me, and why that, hopefully that's, people don't have to be tortured anymore.
Yeah. Thanks for getting us going, Deborah. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, back to you, Matthew.
Okay, so that being said, one of the things that I want to talk about, and there are several themes throughout this novel that I think most people would have picked up on right away. One of them is sexual identity. It's interesting in reviewing the reviews of this book that were contemporary to its publication. I don't know if it was easier or more acceptable, but a lot of people identified the main character, David, as bisexual, because he did have relationships with a woman. In the book, he had been engaged to a woman and he proposed marriage to her. And she said, you know what, that's a super awesome offer. And please, I'm paraphrasing, James Baldwin would have never said super awesome offer. To a woman who said, let me have a minute and I'm gonna go to Spain and think about what you've asked of me. In the meanwhile, David is bored and living in a new city on a very limited income. He's finding it difficult to pay the rent in his flat. And at this bar, through an acquaintance named Jacques, becomes familiar with a boy named Giovanni. And Giovanni is described, it's interesting, there are two characters in the novel that are described as dark. And I don't mean as in emotionally. They're described as, I'm imagining sort of a warm brown complexion. Guillaume and Giovanni, they're both described as dark. Long story short, David thinks he is the cat's pajamas, and he loves him very much. And after their first date, actually takes him to bed, which was very naughty, and then starts questioning himself, and further questioning the relationships he's always had. David, we learn in the beginning, had grown up in Brooklyn. And David lived with his dad because his mom had passed away when he was a small child. I'm guessing 4 or 5. It's not really made clear in the novel. And he's brought up by his father, who is kind of a harsh critic of David. And he also lives with his Aunt Edith. And who wouldn't love an Aunt Edith?
So,
Go on, Marcy.
so I think your question is sexual identity, and I do see a comment. I think it's from Deborah about maybe David was trying to deny his own truth, so not really bisexual. Maybe it was easier to define it that way. I think that's an interesting thread to explore.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thread. So as we learn throughout the course of the novel, his poor relationship with his father, his overbearing Aunt Edith, and eventually he moves to Paris. So he goes to Paris and he meets a gal, and while he's meeting her, he decides, like, well, I got to make a man of myself. Like, like we get along, we're good friends, like we should be married. And proposes marriage to her, and she says, all right, sounds good. Give me several months to think about this while I go on holiday in Spain, because that's normal. And then while she's gone, falls in love with Giovanni. And the reader is left to think, like, well, maybe he does. Maybe Giovanni, or maybe David is having some complications in his mind, or doesn't really understand who he is. And as things progress with Giovanni, he receives a letter from this woman that says, you know what, your offer is great. Like, let me marry you. I'll be back in a bit.
So let's take a pause there and let's talk about, how do we think David was feeling before the letter, after the letter? You know, what were people thinking as they read this?
So there's one more part that's very important. So at this point, David thinks to himself, like, am I into girls? Like, am I into women? I better test the waters one more time. And so a very wealthy American woman named Sue is in Paris at the time, and he has a very meaningless physical exchange with her, as my grandmother would say, had relations with Sue, and realized, like, yeah, that really didn't do it, and starts to beat himself up. And so let's open this up. Like, that can be part of the discussion. Like, he's tested himself twice now. And this is, I haven't mentioned that when he lived in Brooklyn with his father and his Aunt Edith, he had a relationship with a teenager when he was around 13, 14, a boy named Joey, who was his best friend at the time. And after they had this relationship, he bullied him and completely disregarded him. And actually we never find out what happened to Joey. All we know is that David destroyed the relationship they have. So let's open that up and see what people have to say about what was going through David's mind.
Anyone besides Deborah have a comment?
Please, Deborah.
Well, I was just thinking that when people bully, it's because they don't like themselves. I mean, that's what I've seen at school. So, or teens. So maybe that was his, I mean, I don't know. That's all, I guess that's all I could say. He felt ashamed or hated himself for what he'd done. So he bullied his friend and never had that relationship again.
And and feel free, any of you, there are 37 other people in the room that I'd be very glad to hear from. As things move along in the novel, Giovanni realizes what his relationship was with Sue was not right. And then
Matthew, Judy Cold had her hand up.
Oh,
Judy,
please,
you have
Judy.
something? Hi, Judy. Nice to see you. Oh, you're muted. Do you mind taking yourself off mute?
there we go.
I did read the book about 2 years ago with the book club in Northbrook. I had never read James Baldwin. So I thought, first of all, his writing was fantastic. And on many levels, the book was wonderful to read. And David, I think, is just trying to figure out his identity, like a lot of us are. And, you know, whether we're gay or lesbian or not, we're all trying to figure out who we are. So, you know, although a lot of these things were extreme, he's still trying to figure out who he is and hoping to make the right decisions. So I liked the journey that he went through, and I appreciated the whole thing. And again, I thought it was a fantastic book.
And
So
Judy,
a couple of people have mentioned Baldwin. Can we, like, I'm just trying to open up the discussion a little bit. So what is it about James Baldwin that people enjoy reading, make him such a great author? Some of you read this, some of you read other Baldwins. Let's take a step back and try to just talk about Baldwin.
Before we talk about Baldwin, I saw someone named Sue raise their hand. They've since lowered it, but I just wanted to give them an opportunity to speak up.
Okay, yeah, this is Sue. I want to go back to the point because I think it was an interesting theme to explore. On page 5, I don't know if people from the book, it was interesting because he wants freedom, but yet he doesn't want freedom, David. And so he talks about, I don't know if people have the book, but in page 5, he talks about why he asked her to marry, why he wanted to get married to Hella, was to more himself to something. So in my sense is like he almost felt constricted to the role he should have. So I think the reason he bullied Joey is he wanted to explore. When he started to explore who he truly was, he got frightened in the beginning, got frightened by it. And the way to deal with it was to try to repel himself and try to repress himself against Joey. Hence, you know, then when he ran away, he sort of ran away to another country to discover himself, but he couldn't run away from who he was. Okay. So he left to go to France to discover who he was. And who he truly was, you know, someone who was attracted to men. And so, you know, it was interesting because in his exploration of who he was, he constantly was trying to repress his freedom. And so he was exploring this idea of freedom, but also I felt Hella was trying to understand what her role was, because you remember she was exploring what a wife is supposed to be. Yes. And so his exploration was not only women, but also was men. And I think he is such an amazing writer. I've read a lot of his books and have done book discussions, is because he explores human nature and explores the frailties of human nature, and his perspective on human nature is absolutely brilliant. So I think he, you know, obviously is a phenomenal writer. So I'll leave it at that because I don't want to consume any more time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sue. That was actually
go ahead, Matthew. Sorry.
Completely poignant, because one of the other themes outside of sexual identity, and you hit the nail on the head, is shame.
Well, before you go on, there were 2 other hands raised.
Yes,
Someone named Kevin. I didn't catch the names. Michelle, did you see them?
Kevin and then Anne Marie.
Yeah. Well, I've never read Baldwin before, which is a big error on my part. But one of the things that I am pretty well read, and there's lots of great books that I read that, there's times that you kind of want to keep the story, keep moving, and you skip a paragraph or two. This was a book that you didn't want to skip a sentence because it was so beautifully written, and each sentence, each paragraph had so much meaning. It was just beautiful, beautiful prose. One of the things I'd like us to maybe touch on, or Matthew, if you could touch on, is here's a young man who really isn't supporting himself or moving towards any kind of self-sufficiency.
Correct.
And moving towards possibly a marriage, but very dependent on his father, drawing down from the trust in that. And so that was, if we could talk a little bit about that and where that plays into his identity and growing up.
I think that's a brilliant jumping off point for one of the other themes that I think I recognize is gender roles, and that men are supposed to provide. David could not provide. He was living on money that was given to him. And when he was with Giovanni, once Giovanni was angry with his boss and lost his job, the two of them wondered how are they going to survive? And he thought, well, I'll write to my father. And now you have to imagine, this is 1956. He didn't email his dad. Like, he wrote his dad a letter. And so, even today, my friends who live in Britain, my friends who live in the south of France, it takes 5 or 6 days for a letter today to get there. So he was willing to live for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks without knowing where the next meal would come from. In the meantime, he was also pursuing this relationship with Giovanni, but still wondering if things were going to happen with Hella. It's important to remember during the 1950s, sort of the structure of family. It reminds me of my home ec class that I had in high school, which was, I think, taken straight out of the 1950s. Women cooked and sewed and kept house, and men brought home the money. It was sort of like a lovely episode of Bewitched. The housewife always stayed home and was beautiful and perfect and let her husband provide. And this was a society that didn't have 2 male protagonists running a household or 2 female protagonists running a household. We never really understand sort of the age difference that's there between the two of them, but we do know that Giovanni was employed, which was much more than David was at that point. In fact, David couldn't pay his rent, and so he moved in with Giovanni. I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it probably bothered him that he was not the dominant person in the home, that he wasn't the person making the money to pay the rent, that he wasn't the person making the money to buy the food, to go to the bars, to go to the bookshops where him and Jacques would eventually go. It's interesting only because if this novel was written today, I don't think people would be digging as deep into the meanings, Kevin and Anne, of what exactly it meant to be the man of the house. And it is interesting to read this narrative and to know that the protagonist is so very insecure with himself.
So Matthew, there are a couple of notes in the chat that I'm going to read, and a couple of, and one leading to a question. So from Amy, and this goes back to the question about Baldwin. I appreciate Baldwin as ahead of his time and an important voice, but his books are hard to read for me. Go Tell It on the Mountain and this book were hard to get through because of how very sad they are. I think that's interesting because he, in his essence, he's a social commentary, I'm not going to get the word right, but he's doing social commentary. So, the fact that people are, this book is so sad about a character living in a time in society, I think is telling in and of itself. Amy continues that I saw videos of Baldwin at National Museum of African American History and Culture and so impressed by him, so genuine, smart. And kudos to you, Matthew. I really like the way Matthew introduced the evening. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I think there's some really interesting stuff about Baldwin being sad, his being hard to get through with this incredible prose being sad. And then Marcy continues on about Baldwin. James Baldwin is a gift to American literature. With this book, he skillfully demonstrates how gender roles of the time were incredibly oppressive and painful. And the shame of being gay, LGBTQ plus was so deeply embedded in every society. So again, this whole idea of pain and this pain of a character living in society at that point in time coming through, as you've articulated so many times, Matthew. And then Deborah writes this question, I think super interesting. Why do we think that as a group about Baldwin is writing from a white perspective? So, okay, Marcy's, and feel free to use the chat, but we'd love to hear your voices as well. Giovanni's described as dark. Baldwin was writing from powerful writer's perspective. White writers have written about Black characters. Baldwin has written about characters of many races and backgrounds. So he is willing to take on those personas.
And it's also interesting, and I'll just echo my sentiments when I opened that a mainstream press, and when I talk about mainstream press, think about the major nationals that were in big cities, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle. They loved his work. The Black media in the 50s would not review this work. They were often questioning who Baldwin thought he was, that he could write from the perspective of a gay white man. Like, who was he? We also know that James Baldwin, thanks to a recent exhibition we had at the museum, was a crazy radical civil rights movements involvee. Like, he was very involved with shaking up the institution. Like, he wasn't happy with status quo. And I think he was more excited about getting people to pick his novel up and read it and say, like, wow, no one thought twice of the other novels that were written during this time period by very popular authors who were writing about the mysterious Mr. Wong, written by a very American author who was not Asian, but no one seemed to question that in any of their reviews, in any of their commentary on these novels. Also, the 1950s and 1960s was a major civil rights movement going on in the United States. It's even more phenomenal because I kind of feel like Baldwin was poking the bear.
Do we think that was intentional? Like, Kevin and Emery, you have a hand up, but then my question is, I think that's a really interesting observation, Matthew. And do we think it was intentional? And what was his desired outcome by poking that bear? But let's go back to Kevin and Emery with their hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I read somewhere Baldwin explained why he made David white, is that if he had made him Black, he would have had to deal with all the race issues in addition to the gender issues. Mm-hmm. And he wanted the novel to focus just on the gender issues. So by making him white, he didn't have to deal with another can of worms.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was hoping that the audience would bring these golden nuggets forward. That's 100% correct.
Judy has her hand up. Hi,
yes.
Judy.
Yes, I read the same exact thing, that he didn't want to bring up that other issue. And am I incorrect by saying that in the Black community, it's even more taboo to be a gay person, or is that not true?
Well, that's an interesting question. So in the 1950s, arguably, Judy, yes. I mean, I mean, it was not accepted across the board, but in families that were exceptionally observant, i.e. Baptist or Pentecostal families, there were religious ties that were also part of the stigma attached to being gay or lesbian during those times. So that is a fair argument.
Deborah has a hand up. Hi, Deborah.
Please, Deborah.
You may be on mute.
Yes, you are.
Okay, unmute. Thank you. So I was talking to my niece today, and we were discussing the book, and she just mentioned that I'm sorry about my dog. James Baldwin was also anti-Semitic, and he wrote a book about Blacks and why they might be anti-Semitic. And there's a book that he wrote about that. Plus there's a couple articles, not to say that he wasn't a brilliant writer or anything. What I said to Jess was, because I didn't know that this aspect, but we put people in one big kind of, what I want to say, like this, I don't know, we're complex. It doesn't take away from what he has done, but people are complex. So there may be, when we give accolades to, we're just diverse. So people can be this and this. And I don't know if anybody else has heard anything about that, or that it even means anything to this book, except that I just want to say that we're not, I don't know, I guess I just want to know if anybody else has anything to say about that. She brought that up right away to me, so I'm just mentioning it.
I saw someone, Adam Schwartz, had, oh, you're muted. You are muted.
So, if you read his essay called The Fire Next Time, there's I think it was that one, where his best friend was Jewish, and he brought him home for lunch one day, and his father said to him, "Is he Christian?" And James Baldwin said, "No, he's Jewish." And his father slapped him in the face. And James Baldwin walked out the room and he said, "But he's a better Christian than you are."
Was that a story, or was that a part of a book or a news report, or what? I'm sorry, I missed the beginning where you said where that came from.
That happened. There's a book of his essay called The Fire Next Time. It's excellent. And not just about writing, but about insight. He's absolutely profound. When you read it, it just kind of blows your mind at some of the things he said. But anyway, he had that. His best friend was Jewish. And his father didn't want a Jew in his house. And he said he's a better Christian than you are. Yeah. That's it. That's all I'm saying. I don't think he was anti-Semitic at all. I don't believe he was, according to what I've never seen anything anti-Semitic in his essays or his novels.
I just want to throw a question out there that Giovanni's Room is one of the only novel without an African-American character that Baldwin wrote. And I wonder if you think that's significant to the topic.
I mean, I'll chime in. I think it's interesting that he chose David being white, right? An author writes a book because they have a desired outcome or a desired impact they want to have. And it seems to me that he chose to explore this issue, like we said earlier, because he didn't want to, it wanted to be a pure exploration of that issue without introducing the Black experience. And I've been playing with that in my own head. Like, did he did he make the book more simple because of that? Could it have been more complex? Could have explored more issues? So I think it's interesting that he chose not to, but he did that by design, and that's his prerogative as a writer.
Right. And I would like to counter that or play devil's advocate to that and say that he wrote it from that perspective because it garnered more attention. I don't think that people in the 1950s were ready to hear about, let alone read a novel about a Black guy, but to read a novel about a Black gay guy and a Black gay guy who was living in Europe on his parents' money. I mean, people, I would like to posit that I don't think people would have believed the story. Giovanni's Room, for me at least, I have read this novel so many times, and every time I know what I'm in for. There are two things. Breakfast at Tiffany's, when she throws that cat in the alley, I know I'm going to cry like a baby. And when I read Giovanni's Room, every single time I do that sort of like cry shudder. Like when I finish, I'm just like, why did you do this to yourself again, Matthew? It's so believable. It could have happened. And I don't know. I would love to hear what all of you have to think about it. What are your reactions to the novel? What were your visceral reactions to the novel? Like what came out of you when you finished it? Or if you haven't read it, what made you come tonight?
Judy?
I must say, by having read this book when I'm in my older years, is much different than I think I would have gotten the perspective when I was much younger. And like everything else, I think we appreciate things so much more the more knowledge we have. So I think this book for me made so much more of an impact reading it later on in life than very early on. So Matthew, I would like to hear from you, from all the times you have read the book.
Yes.
The first time you read it, how did the book impress you? And then over the years, did you look at it from a different angle? Or how did your evolution come with this novel?
That is a fantastic question. And I love, especially, I will confess, I know Judy, I adore Judy. And so I'm very happy to answer this question. So like I said, I quite literally stole this book from the library in 1994. It was my freshman year of college. I was 17 years old, and I knew what the novel was about. Kind of knew what the novel was about, but I wanted to read it because I thought maybe it would make me better. Maybe it would help me grow. After I read this novel, I couldn't deal with anything for about 24 hours. It was like I had been punched in the face. I didn't want a sad ending. I wanted this to be the story that I was going to live. Like maybe I would identify with the character and I would think like, I'm going to live in Paris and I'm going to be an author. Like this is going to be amazing. Like at that time, I wasn't thinking like I was going to be a librarian in a Holocaust museum. And as I read it the second time, it made me really sad. And now when I read it, it's one of those things that I read that, I don't know, do all of you have a summer beach book? Like every year I make a point of reading a book, one of my favorite books every year. This is one of them. The other one is called The Winthrop Woman. It's completely different. It's historical fiction about an Elizabethan era woman that comes to the United States. And now when I read this, I just think, ugh, it's heartbreaking. It's so sad. It's still so sad. Like I've now, because I'm 45 years old, I've had my heart broken. No one has ever been executed for murdering their boss. That I will say. But the first time I read this book, I was gutted. And now I'm moved. And it's amazing to me. I know the ending. I know the beginning. I can quote passages. And it still moves me from a space that I'm in. It takes me away. It's a beautiful question. Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome. Thank you for the answer.
There's so much going on in the chat. I would just say if your chat's not open, give it a read. There's too much for me to recap. There is a New York Times article that addresses the anti-Semitic question, which is, I think people might find of interest. There's some more stuff about just Baldwin and his personal experiences and his ability to move people as an author. Matthew, we're at, probably we have about 13 minutes left. So we have about 10 minutes of discussion and then a 3-minute kind of wind down. So I don't know, I'm giving you a time check.
I would love to know from anybody, there are so many characters in this book. There's Hella, there's David, there's Guillaume, there's Jacques, there's David, there's Joey, there's Sue. The characters felt very real to me. Someone mentioned in the comments that the characters felt very real. And for a book that's literally like 175 pages long, like he built true characters. Like all of us know one of those people. We all know the boy whose first boyfriend was mean to him. We all know the woman who was scorned by a lover. We all know the elderly man who doesn't have a wife. And maybe, just maybe, he has a boyfriend. I'm wondering if any of the characters resounded with you, or what your emotions were around any of the characters in the novel.
Or who was your favorite and why? Maybe we just simple the question up a little bit. Anyone?
I can see Deborah talking, but I think muted.
Yeah, I was going to type this, and just because I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll just say
Not
it.
possible, not
Okay.
possible.
I felt that Giovanni seemed the most desperate. Not that David wasn't, dealing with things, but Giovanni was young and he just felt so desperate and alone, and I don't know. I think that's all I wanted to say, because you said what character. I just felt, the saddest for him.
I mean, honestly, we gather from the novel that Giovanni was basically an immigrant to Paris, and he took a job as a bartender. Well, yes, Parisian waitstaff are among the finest of the fine in France. I can imagine in the 50s being a bartender was probably not the best job in the whole world, and that he lived in a small room. One thing that I will posit here is that Giovanni's room was actually a character in the novel.
Mm-hmm.
It was a space, and we were made as intimate with that space that David was sitting in, that they had made love in, that they were living in. We learn as much about that dark, quiet space as we do about many of the characters. We know more about that room than we know about Sue. And I always found that room to be very claustrophobic. I wanted him so much to leave that space, but the space meant so much to David. And I think it's from the experiences he had in that space. I mean, we all have a space that we find to be our special place. For me, it's in front of the fireplace in the first library that I ever visited as a child. For Giovanni and for David, that space was their world. And I think it's interesting that Baldwin was actually able to transform space into a character. At least that's my opinion. I would love to know if any of you agree or disagree with that. Judith?
Yes.
Yes. Did you?
Yes, I think that's the perfect title for the book, because it was a character and you could feel it like it was a character. And although David had the biggest role and he was the most complex, every character had something special about them. And again, that's the skill of the writer, for you to be compassionate and passionate about all the characters. And again, Baldwin did a wonderful job of creating these people that you all liked and all felt sorry for them or felt elated for them. Like you say, it's very sad. The whole book is very sad, but he made them so poignant that you don't forget them.
Yeah, Marcy's chiming in with a comment in the chat that related to this conversation, that oppressive space tells us so much of their lives, their personalities, dreams, and conflicts.
And at one point, I mean, after David moves in with Giovanni, Giovanni loses his job. He punches the bartender who employs him because he feels that perhaps he was, I kind of understood it that Giovanni was hitting on Giovanni, was making advances at Giovanni, and he wasn't comfortable with that. And he punched him. And sort of when he couldn't get his job back, Giovanni got a little bit more angry and maybe sort of murdered him. And in this novel, the ending isn't just that Giovanni is going to be sentenced to death. He's going to be guillotined. There's something very dramatic about that, something very French. We don't use a guillotine as a method of punishment anymore. It's interesting because every space that they seem to be in, or a space that's explained to us, the bookshop, the bar, Giovanni's room, everything is a space, a small space where I feel like it's sweaty and people are too near each other. There's not enough space to be yourself. And perhaps that's a larger metaphor for the whole novel, that we need to find a place to be, a safe place to be. I see Anne says that the room is their safe place. And perhaps maybe I'm, as Freud said, maybe a cigar is a cigar. Maybe that's all this novel was. It was something to entertain me. But it's also amazing to me that in 1956, this was not only about race and homosexuality, but this is a thriller. This is a romance. This is a, how do they call them? A journey novel. Like now, like Giada goes to Italy and makes pasta. And we read that and we pay $40 for a 25-page book with 30 pages of glossy pictures. This has nothing like that. And we are all riveted and we are all tied to it and we all have emotional bonds with the character. And I'm sure at some point, all of us shook our finger at one character and said, I can't agree with you. I don't like the choice you just made. And that was the exciting part because I had emotions about people. And when I closed the book, I said, Matthew, this is a book. And yet each one of them elicited some sort of reaction out of me. I am afraid that we are at 7:56 right now. And so I want to hand it to Marcy to sort of tell you about what's next.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I'll take any last comments or questions before I talk about what's coming up at the museum. Anyone have anything else to say? Thank you. Great to thank you. And I was going to go there. Matthew, thank you for a great discussion, the historical context and your unique and personal point of view about the book. It's been so lovely and enlightening to hear. Couple of things coming up. Our next book club, Michelle helped me with the date, is Train.
And that will be on November 16th at 7 p.m.
And it's our moderator will be Daniel Cohen. So it is an author moderated session. So come hear from Daniel about his very unique perspective as the author of this book. More on our website under events. And then our next event is, Michelle, help me again.
To unmute myself, the very next program is happening in just a couple of days on October 21st. It's called In Search of a Jewish Story in China. Again, that one's October 21st, and it starts at 6:30 p.m.
Great. And so much more going on at the museum. Check out our public program page and you can see everything that's coming up probably for the next 4 or 5 months. We're starting to do programs back in person, but we're also including virtual links for almost everything we're doing. So it's up to you. If you're feeling social and want to see people, put on your mask and come to the museum. If you'd rather hunker down at home with a blanket and a glass of wine, that's always an option too. So we're trying to meet everyone's needs as we move forward. And I will say, your Rise Up opened. We have virtual drop-in tours that will be starting in the next few weeks. I think we're still just finishing, like Deborah gave the first ones that today, the virtual tour has just been finished. So you'll be able to register for a virtual drop-in tour on our website, or if you're up for an outing, get yourself to the museum. We tend to be less crowded in the morning if you're trying to avoid crowds, but do come and see Rise Up. It's an incredible exhibition. And we're so happy you're here. We're happy for this community, and we're happy to be doing book club again. So hope to see you soon.
And thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. You had a lot of options to entertain yourself this Tuesday evening, and I'm glad you chose me and Giovanni's room over Netflix or Amazon Prime.
Bye everyone, have a great night.
Good night, everyone.